Welcome back to the deep dive. You've given us an intense stack of sources today. We're looking at a truly global snapshot, all taken on one specific and, well, highly volatile day, November 27, 2025. It feels less like a collection of headlines and more like, I don't know, an anatomy lesson in global fragility.
It is a stunning amount of information to process in one sitting, yeah. We're covering everything from these huge political standoffs that can just paralyze the world's largest economy to really brutal and localized conflicts. And then you have these massive, deadly climate disasters and warnings about existential biological threats that are sort of hidden away in lab reports.
Exactly, the sheer volume of it all. And the diversity. I mean, the crises are happening everywhere, from D.C. to Hong Kong, from the front lines in Ukraine to the jungles of Southeast Asia. It really confirms that the world is, in a very real sense, fighting simultaneous battles on all fronts.
That's the perfect way to put it. Look at the range you just mentioned. You have this very specific, very explosive chaos coming from a high-profile shooting in Washington, D.C. And at the exact same time, you have these unprecedented floods tearing across Southeast Asia.
And you see the systemic vulnerability of, say, aging urban infrastructure being exposed in a Hong Kong high-rise right next to these monumental breakthroughs in gene therapy that promise to, eliminate inherited diseases entirely.
So our mission today really is to move beyond just reciting headlines and to structure this complex data set into logical, digestible segments. We need to try and identify the deep connective tissue, what ties these seemingly disparate events together. We're really focusing on that constant tension between the immediate explosive crises that, they dominate the news cycle, and then the long-term sort of slow burn systemic failures in governance, in infrastructure, and climate policy that actually cause them in the first place.
So we are setting the stage with a day that is truly defined by simultaneous battles. You've got Russian forces tightening a military noose around a key Ukrainian city. You have Asian governments battling the unrelenting and frankly amplified force of climate change. And at the same time, our public health experts are grappling with the ticking clock of potential biological threats.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with the security picture, which includes a really severe domestic flashpoint that just immediately polarized the U.S. political landscape.
Right. We begin in Washington, D.C. with a tragic incident that almost instantly became a national security and immigration lightning rod. And we're talking about a targeted attack near the perimeter of the White House. I mean, one of the most heavily secured areas on Earth.
So the incident itself centered around a shooting that happened the day before, on November 26th. But on the 27th, which is our focus day, officials confirmed that a National Guard member who had been wounded near that highly policed White House area had actually died from his injuries. And this was very quickly ruled out as a random act of violence. Investigators were quite clear they believed it was a targeted ambush on uniformed personnel who were sitting in a parked vehicle.
And then came the detail that changed everything.
Exactly. The identification of the suspect. That just changed the entire political conversation in a heartbeat. The attacker was identified as an Afghan national who had been living in the United States. And that, of course, immediately inflamed these long-running, very bitter debates over the integrity of the U.S. refugee and asylum vetting processes, specifically the ones put in place after the withdrawal from Afghanistan back in 2021.
The political fallout was, well, it was swift, it was targeted, and it was sharp. President Trump publicly labeled the soldier's death as a clear case of terror. And senior administration officials, they wasted absolutely no time announcing significant new visa restrictions.
Right, and these restrictions were aimed specifically at nationals from Afghanistan, with the potential to expand to include other countries that Homeland Security deemed, quote, high risk.
So this one incident became an immediate partisan lightning rod. It just highlighted the deep existing divisions in Washington.
Oh, absolutely. Administration allies argued the incident was basically vindication for their position. They claimed that vetting had been demonstrably too lax, and this was the tragic proof. They leveraged the tragedy to push for much tougher screening procedures, for expanded federal authority to detain or even deport individuals who were flagged as potential security risks, even if it was just based on, tentative intelligence.
And on the other side?
On the other side, Democrats and advocates for immigrant and refugee rights, they immediately pushed back, and hard. They warned really vigorously against stigmatizing the overwhelming majority of Afghan evacuees. I mean, people who had cooperated with or directly assisted U.S. forces and who had already passed multiple very complex layers of background checks to even get here.
So their argument was that you can't use this single horrific event to rewrite broad life-altering policy, that it risks punishing thousands of people who are, fleeing the very same terrorism the U.S. claims to be fighting.
Precisely. But beyond the political theater, the core security questions here are deeply concerning. How did an attacker successfully surveil and then ambush uniformed personnel in an area that is protected by this dense network of agencies? You've got the Secret Service, Park Police, D.C. Police, and the National Guard itself all operating there. It raises some really serious concerns about coordination and, frankly, intelligence failures.
And the expected result is already becoming clear. What happens next?
Well, we're going to see a significant and very visible expansion of security perimeters. That's almost a given. It could potentially restrict public access around federal buildings even more than it already is, and we'll likely see more aggressive policing in central Washington, D.C.
Which, necessary or not, inevitably raises these serious civil liberties concerns. I mean, the ability of citizens to peacefully protest, to access public spaces in their own nation's capital. It's that classic security versus liberty trade-off, and it's being triggered by a single high-stakes event.
A textbook case.
Okay, now let's pivot from that domestic security tightening to the harsh realities of international conflict. Specifically, we're going to the occupied West Bank, where violence has been escalating relentlessly.
Right. And the incident that drew major international attention on November 27th happened in the town of Tubas. Video footage began circulating very widely, and that's a critical detail because it instantly bypassed traditional media filters. It appeared to show two Palestinian men surrendering to Israeli troops during an operation.
What exactly did the video show?
The video reportedly showed the men emerging from a structure with your hands clearly raised, in a universal sign of surrender, and then collapsing after being shot. They were killed at the scene.
The visual nature of that evidence, I imagine, brought immediate and intense global scrutiny.
It did. Palestinian officials very quickly denounced the killings as nothing less than an execution and a war crime. They were demanding that international bodies, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, launch immediate independent investigations.
And this incident must place intense, renewed pressure on Israel's key allies. I'm thinking of the United States in particular.
Absolutely, to condition military aid. Specifically, critics are calling for restrictions on the type of equipment and weapons being supplied, particularly those used in these kinds of close-quarters raids and crowd control operations in the West Bank.
And Israel's response?
Well, the Israeli army did commit to probing whether operational protocols were violated, which is standard procedure. But human rights groups immediately expressed deep skepticism. They're pointing to a very long history of these kinds of internal inquiries that they argue rarely result in meaningful prosecutions or any kind of systemic change.
And it's so important to connect this military and political violence to the crushing humanitarian realities just miles away. The source material details this horrific situation faced by displaced Gazans. They aren't just enduring the trauma of war, but are now struggling with the harsh effects of environmental shock.
That's right. We're talking about massive, sudden, heavy rains and flooding that have swept through the makeshift tent camps where hundreds of thousands of people have sought refuge.
I can't even imagine surviving constant bombardment only to have your last remaining possessions. Clothes, blankets, food rations, just soaked and ruined by standing water and mud.
And this flooding is so much more than an inconvenience. It raises immediate critical public health risks. The saturation of the ground, the mixture of sewage and standing water, it dramatically increases the threat of waterborne diseases like cholera, exposure illnesses, respiratory infections, especially in these densely packed, completely unsanitary conditions.
So the Gaza situation really is a stark illustration of this dual challenge that seems to define modern conflict zones.
It is. It highlights precisely how environmental shocks, which are becoming more and more unpredictable and intense because of global climate patterns, how they act as a catastrophic multiplier. They dramatically worsen living conditions, they exacerbate existing trauma, and they push humanitarian systems past their breaking point. All while the political deadlock prevents any meaningful infrastructure repair or long-term solutions.
A crisis on top of a crisis.
Exactly.
Okay, moving now to Eastern Europe. The conflict in Ukraine provides what seems to be a classic case study in a dual-track strategy. Intense military pressure being used explicitly to generate some cautious diplomatic flexibility.
That's a great way to frame it. The military reality on the ground remains focused, as it has been for months, on the strategic city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Russian forces are intensifying their efforts to tighten the noose around the city. Ukrainian officials are warning that Russian troops are successfully taking the surrounding villages and are attempting to cut crucial supply routes.
And what are those routes? What makes them so crucial?
Specifically, they're targeting the main logistical lines needed to resupply the Ukrainian garrison that's defending the city. This is their lifeline for ammunition, for food, for reinforcements.
And why Pokrovsk? Why is the city so important strategically?
It's not just a town. It serves as a critical railway and road hub. Its capture would be a major blow. It wouldn't just secure a huge logistical advantage for Russia, but it would also open up the path for deeper advances into the rest of the Donbass region. This military action, it really echoes the patient, grinding tactics Russia used to capture previous strongholds like Bakhmut and Avdiivka.
So they systematically eliminate supply lines before initiating the final assault.
Precisely. It's methodical. But while this pressure is mounting on the ground, the diplomatic track has suddenly and interestingly become active. President Vladimir Putin publicly described the recent U.S. peace proposal, which reportedly involves freezing the current lines of conflict, as a viable starting point for negotiations.
That's a shift. That's not the outright rejection we've often seen from the Kremlin.
Not at all. But, crucially, Putin's caveat was immediate, and it was firm. He insisted that any settlement reached must formally recognize and reflect Russia's de facto control over the currently occupied territories. And that, right there, sets the primary and what seems to be an insurmountable barrier to any kind of sustainable peace.
So how are other countries reacting to this dual strategy?
The reactions are profoundly conflicting, especially across Europe. Many European governments are facing significant economic strain. You've got energy market disruptions, ongoing inflation, the massive fiscal cost of defense spending. They see potential stability and, frankly, relief in a negotiated freeze. They're actively looking for an off-ramp that stops the flow of money and men into this conflict.
But the Ukrainians must see it very differently.
Of course. Conversely, the Ukrainians fear, and rightly so, that this approach would fundamentally reward aggression. It would set a terrible international precedent that completely undermines the norm against territorial conquest by force. Kyiv maintains that freezing the lines simply cements Russia's gains and sets the stage for a future conflict once Russia has had time to consolidate those positions and rearm.
So what's the big takeaway here?
The takeaway is sophisticated. The intense fighting around Pokrovsk is Russia's deliberate attempt to define the borders of that proposed freeze on its own terms. It's a strategy of maximalist military success being used to negotiate from a position of overwhelming strength. It ensures that if a diplomatic solution is reached, it will be based on the battlefield realities that they're creating right now today.
So the fighting and the talking are completely intertwined. Okay, our final security flashpoint looks at persistent, multifaceted crises across Africa, highlighting both the tragedy of organized domestic criminality and this broader regional political destabilization.
In Nigeria, the crisis surrounding abductions seems to have reached a critical mass. The president declared a national security emergency in response to an overwhelming surge in mass kidnappings, including the recent, very highly publicized abduction of school children.
And what does that emergency actually entail?
It forced the reinforcement of federal forces, with additional troops being deployed to secure vulnerable areas. We're talking about schools, major highways. It's an attempt to project strength and, try to restore some semblance of order.
But kidnapping for ransom has sadly plagued Nigeria for years, hasn't it? This isn't a new problem.
Not at all. It's driven by a complex mix of organized armed gangs, opportunistic bandits, and extremist groups who are all exploiting these vast areas of weak central governance. And while the declaration of an emergency is intended to reassure the public, there is deep-seated skepticism among Nigerians. This is due to a long history of corruption within the security forces, and frankly, years of previous unfulfilled promises of action.
That skepticism seems entirely justified. You mentioned the root causes earlier.
It is. Analysts consistently warn that while military measures are necessary to secure immediate areas, they are fundamentally insufficient to stem the tide of criminality without addressing those deep-root causes. We're talking about poverty, massive youth unemployment that creates this huge pool of easily recruited young men, and systemic governance deficits that leave entire communities exposed and unprotected.
So until the economic and political underpinnings of the crime are solved, military deployments will only offer temporary relief at best.
That's the argument, yes. It's a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Now, you contrast that long-running domestic criminal crisis with the sudden political instability we saw in Guinea-Bissau.
Right, a very different kind of crisis. In a move that was immediately condemned by regional bodies, soldiers seized power. They declared a coup just days after national elections, following reports of intense gunfire near the presidential palace.
And this is part of a larger worrying trend in the region, isn't it?
It is extremely concerning because it contributes to a rapidly growing and worrying regional trend. Guinea-Bissau joins this growing, very uncomfortable list of West and Central African nations that have experienced military takeover since 2020. This wave of coups has just eroded democratic progress and created a climate of instability that is so easily exploited by global criminal networks and transnational extremist groups.
And the condemnation from international bodies, does it have any real effect?
Well, it's swift, but the effect of instability in one nation often fuels broader regional instability. Militaries in neighboring states are watching. They're watching to see whether these power grabs are successfully consolidated without any severe international punishment. It can have a domino effect.
Okay, let's shift our analysis now from conflict and security to the messy reality of economic policy, geopolitics, and how national systems respond to these internal and external pressures. We have to start where the money is. The U.S. economy has struggled to recover from its historic government shutdown.
The 2025 federal government shutdown really stands out, not just because it happened, but because of its sheer duration. It was driven by this bitter partisan standoff over extending the expanded subsidies within the Affordable Care Act. And it lasted a crippling 43 days, finally concluding on November 12th.
So just a couple of weeks before our snapshot day, what was the immediate post-mortem? How were they trying to tally up the damage?
The focus was on quantifying that damage, yes. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he attempted to manage market expectations. He estimated a permanent loss of about $11 billion in output. And that's not just delayed spending, that's economic activity that is permanently erased. Gone.
So that $11 billion is just gone. It's not coming back when federal workers get their back pay.
A large portion of it, no. Think about lost tourism revenue, canceled contracts, projects that were put on hold and then scrapped. That activity is just lost forever. And while Bessent downplayed the risk of a broad, immediate recession, he was arguing that upcoming tax cuts and signals from the Fed about easing interest rates offered some hope. He had to acknowledge the sector-specific damage.
Which sectors were hit the hardest?
He admitted that interest rate-sensitive sectors, most notably the housing market, had effectively entered recessionary conditions. And that was due to the massive disruption in federal loan processing and just general regulatory uncertainty. You couldn't get a federally backed mortgage approved.
And this kind of political dysfunction, it has to carry a psychological toll as well, right? Beyond the numbers.
A huge one. The source material shows that consumer confidence plummeted sharply in November, hitting its lowest reading since April. And this wasn't just driven by high prices, it was driven by this lingering anxiety over political instability, the fear that basic government functions are no longer reliable.
And what are the economists outside of the administration saying?
They're sounding even more alarmist. They warn that repeated self-inflicted wounds like these 43-day shutdowns, they erode long-term global confidence in U.S. governance. And critically, they increase the cost of borrowing for the U.S. government over time. When confidence declines, investors demand a higher premium to lend you money.
So this episode reinforces the concern that basic budget functions are now routinely held hostage to partisan fights. And that incurs economic and social costs far beyond the immediate dip in GDP. It's the cost of doing business in a highly polarized political environment. And that $11 billion price tag is a heavy reminder.
It's a very heavy reminder.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. In Canada, we see a textbook example of raw regional political pressure forcing a federal government to make a really abrupt U-turn on its long-held climate policies, prioritizing regional economic stability over, it seems, international commitments.
Yeah, Canada, maybe more than any other G7 nation, has struggled to reconcile its ambition for climate leadership, through things like carbon pricing and emissions caps, with its identity as a major global oil and gas exporter. That tension finally broke on November 27th. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government signed a far-reaching landmark agreement with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith.
And the centerpiece of this deal was a fundamental retreat from federal climate goals.
A complete retreat. The agreement scraps the planned federal emissions cap on the oil and gas sector, which was a cornerstone of their previous climate policy. And maybe even more controversially, it drops the federal clean electricity regulations that were designed to phase out fossil fuel generation across the entire country.
So what did the federal government get in return for giving up so much?
In return, Alberta, which is the heart of the nation's energy sector, agreed to bolster its own industrial carbon pricing system. And crucially, it committed support to the massive Pathways Plus carbon capture and storage project. This is a really important distinction. Alberta is accepting carbon capture as a technological solution, but it is rejecting federally mandated punitive emissions caps.
We should probably unpack Pathways Plus a bit. What is that exactly? Isn't carbon capture a good thing?
It's a multi-billion-dollar, industry-led initiative aimed at capturing carbon dioxide from the oil sands facilities and then storing it deep underground. And yes, in theory, it can be a tool, but the political calculation here is very clear. The federal government is substituting a regulatory cap, which the industry hates, with a massive technological investment plan that is politically acceptable to the energy-producing province.
But environmental groups must be furious.
Oh, the agreement had immediate severe fallout. Environmental groups condemned the deal almost universally. They called it a race to the bottom. They argued it fundamentally jeopardizes Canada's ability to meet its binding 2030 and 2050 emissions targets and severely damages its credibility on the international climate stage right before the next UN climate talks.
And the protest wasn't just external, was it?
No, it was internal too. The former Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, resigned from the cabinet in protest. He accused the Carney administration of dismantling the entire climate agenda he had spent years constructing. And this deal also paves the way for a new oil pipeline to British Columbia, which is immediately facing fierce opposition from indigenous leaders who cite unacceptable risks to crucial salmon habitats and marine ecosystems.
So this is a defining fight for Canada with massive implications.
It is. It's not just balancing energy and climate, but it's setting the stage for years of future conflict.
Okay, from North American policy reversals, let's examine how two heavily sanctioned strategic global powers, Venezuela and Iran, are navigating extreme economic isolation and internal price pressures.
Right. Venezuela's isolation deepened dramatically on this day. The authorities there took the extreme step of revoking the operating rights of 6 major international carriers. We're talking globally recognized names: Iberia, TAP Air, Portugal, Avianca, LATAM Colombia, Turkish Airlines, and Gull.
And why? What prompted such a drastic move?
This decision followed a critical advisory from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. The FAA had warned airlines about a potentially hazardous situation in Venezuelan airspace due to heightened military activity and worsening security conditions on the ground. So when the airlines began suspending service on their own, Caracas accused them of participating in acts of state terrorism promoted by the United States.
So regardless of the political rhetoric, the practical effect is real. It severely reduces Venezuela's already limited international connectivity, making travel, trade, even diplomatic movement significantly more difficult.
Absolutely. For the Maduro government, it's a performative act of defiance against U.S. pressure. But it guarantees further economic and diplomatic isolation at a time when the country desperately needs more international engagement, not less.
Now, contrast that external isolation with Iran's highly sensitive domestic economic risk management.
A very different approach to pressure. Iran unveiled a new, much higher gasoline price tier. And this is a policy reform that is known to carry immense political risk in Iran.
Iran has heavily subsidized fuel for decades, right, making it artificially cheap. But those subsidies must be economically devastating for a country struggling under crippling sanctions.
They are. They're a huge drain on the state budget. The new tier, which is set to take effect soon, dictates that consumption over 160 liters per month, which impacts a significant segment of middle-class drivers, will jump to 50,000 reals per liter. That's roughly triple the current mid-tier price. It's a huge jump.
And the historical precedent for this kind of thing is not good in Iran.
The historical precedent is terrifying for Tehran. Past price reforms, specifically in 2007 and then much more explosively in 2019, they triggered widespread, sometimes violent, national protests that the regime really struggled to suppress.
So while international economists might applaud this as a necessary step toward rationalizing state finances, the fear among ordinary Iranians must be profound.
It is. The fear is that higher fuel prices will trigger rapid runaway inflation across the transport and food sectors, further squeezing already strained households. The government insists they've learned lessons from the past, that they're moving more gradually and keeping a large quota of fuel at a lower price. But this move is being watched internationally as a critical test of Tehran's ability to manage that simmering domestic discontent while restructuring its sanctions-hit economy.
Okay, we finished this section with two contrasting national policy signals. One focused on cracking down on financial crime, the other on national cohesion and strategic human capital development.
In Brazil, police launched a massive, coordinated operation targeting a colossal financial crime network. They were investigating a scheme estimated to involve $4.8 billion in tax evasion and money laundering within the country's fuel sector.
Wow. The sheer scale of that operation alone signals a newly assertive approach by Brazilian authorities toward financial enforcement and combating high-level corruption.
It does. And the focus on the fuel sector is significant, as illicit activities there often affect consumer prices and state revenue collection. This crackdown demonstrates a commitment to recovering lost tax revenue and improving the rule of law, which is crucial for international investor confidence.
Meanwhile, in France, a very different kind of policy announcement. President Macron announced the details of a new 10-month mandatory civic service program for residents aged 18 and 19. This is essentially a new form of voluntary military service.
The explicit aim is threefold: to develop discipline, technical skills, and a sense of shared national purpose among young adults. But you have to look at the broader context. This policy reflects evolving European security calculations. In a post-Ukraine war environment, there's a very serious debate happening within the EU and NATO about the importance of military readiness, national service, and preparing populations for a potentially volatile future. France is essentially investing in human capital with a clear strategic security overlay.
Okay, let's shift now to a very sobering section, focusing on massive, deadly disasters. This section examines how human factors, density, inequality, mismanagement all combine with climate change to amplify hazards across Asia.
Right, and this tragedy in Hong Kong is one of the most devastating headlines of the day. Authorities confirmed on November 27th that twin fires in a dense residential high-rise complex killed 94 people. That makes it one of the city's deadliest fire disasters in its history.
And this tragedy is a grim symbol of this systemic vulnerability created by rapid urbanization and ingrained inequality. Hong Kong is famous for its vertical density, but many of the older, lower-income high-rises where this fire occurred were built under far looser safety standards than modern structures.
That's the core of the problem. The catastrophe immediately exposed these profound urban safety gaps. Investigators are focusing on a whole list of systemic failures: reports of illegally modified units that served as fuel or obstructions, malfunctioning smoke alarms, and crucially, exit routes, like fire doors and stairwells, that were reportedly blocked or cluttered, preventing residents from escaping or rescue crews from being able to gain access.
So are we saying these older buildings were just forgotten or ignored?
That's what housing advocates and grieving families are demanding to know. They want accountability. They're questioning whether officials, both at the Housing Authority and the Fire Department, adequately enforced the existing codes, whether they allowed public and private housing in these densely packed older districts to deteriorate into death traps simply because the residents lacked the political capital to demand better.
And there's a larger implication here that urban planners are sounding the alarm about.
There is. The vulnerability doesn't stop at fire. Climate-driven factors like increasingly frequent and intense heat waves will place enormous strain on these same aging building systems. You'll see grid failures, strained emergency cooling systems, and it will further highlight the inequality that's baked into the city's housing stock. Hong Kong is now forced to confront a massive, incredibly expensive project of retrofitting safety into its oldest, most populated residential towers.
And while that's happening, the devastating effects of extreme weather are tragically visible across Southeast Asia, hitting two major nations with these sudden, catastrophic rainfall events within days of each other.
In Indonesia, flash floods and landslides struck North Sumatra province. They led to a confirmed death toll of at least 69 people, with almost 60 others still reported missing. Entire villages and homes were just swept away. Crucial infrastructure like bridges collapsed under the sheer force of the water.
And what made this event so particularly deadly? Was it just the rain?
It was the human factor. Environmental groups and researchers point to chronic deforestation and unregulated construction on steep terrain, which dramatically destabilized the slopes. So when the heavy rains hit, the ground just gave way, triggering these deadly landslides and massive debris flows. It just illustrates how poor environmental governance, logging, mining, uncontrolled hillside development can turn a heavy rainfall event into a major human catastrophe.
And at the same time, in southern Thailand, they were experiencing rain that officials were struggling to even describe. They were calling it a once in 300 years event. The torrential downpour left massive parts of the region completely underwater, affecting an estimated 2 million people and killing over 80.
The images are shocking. Major urban centers like Hat Yai saw their streets turn into rivers with chest-deep water. It paralyzed commerce, forced mass evacuations. The Thai Navy was compelled to deploy its flagship aircraft carrier just to assist with massive relief and evacuation efforts in the flooded coastal areas.
These two disasters, though they're thousands of miles apart, they really do share a common DNA.
They do. They both highlight the amplification of hazards by climate change, by rapid, unplanned urbanization, and environmental mismanagement. Things like the loss of vital coastal mangroves that naturally protect against this kind of flooding.
And that terminology itself is becoming contentious. When officials use a phrase like once in 300 years, I mean, if these extreme, unprecedented events are happening every few years, the baseline has fundamentally shifted. We need to stop using historical statistics that misrepresent our current reality.
That's exactly the debate among climate scientists and disaster response advocates. The language we use matters.
So these twin tragedies in Indonesia and Thailand, they must create immense political pressure on both governments. Pressure to move beyond just cleanup and fundamentally change their long-term infrastructure and development strategies.
The required response demands major, costly investment. These governments are facing urgent calls to drastically improve early warning systems, to invest billions in climate-resilient infrastructure, better drainage, coastal defenses, improved dam management, and, perhaps most politically fraught, to seriously consider relocating high-risk settlements that are situated on unstable slopes or vulnerable floodplains.
And this human cost, it must feed directly into the most contentious ongoing debates at the UN climate talks.
It absolutely does. The severity of these events strengthens the moral and practical arguments for increased funding for climate adaptation in developing countries. It's an acknowledgement that these nations are disproportionately bearing the immediate physical costs of climate change. And crucially, it feeds the push to operationalize funding for loss and damage.
Right, that's the concept that developed. Historically, high-emitting nations must financially support vulnerable countries for damages that can't be adapted away, like the permanent loss of life, property, and agricultural land we're seeing in Sumatra and southern Thailand.
Exactly. It's about accountability for irreversible loss.
Okay, we transition now to public health and science, and this section holds a really unique juxtaposition. You've got these urgent existential warnings about biological risks running parallel to the promise of monumental scientific progress.
Yeah, and this is arguably the most critical global health update in our entire stack of sources today. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, specifically the H5 strain, is circulating widely among birds, and increasingly it's infecting mammals, including U.S. dairy cows. Now, human cases remain extremely rare, but the fatality rate in those cases that have occurred is worryingly high.
And on November 27, France's Institut Pasteur, a leading global center for disease research, issued a very stark and attention-grabbing warning.
They did. They stated unequivocally that if the current H5 strain mutates to acquire the ability to spread efficiently between humans, it could trigger a pandemic worse than COVID-19.
Worse than COVID-19. Why? What's the reasoning behind such a strong statement?
Well, the chief reason cited by the medical director there, Marianne Remex-Welty, is biological vulnerability. Unlike seasonal flu, the vast majority of the human population lacks any baseline antibodies against H5. We have no natural defense. Moreover, she stressed that, unlike some milder seasonal variants, influenza viruses like H5 have demonstrated the capacity to be lethal even in otherwise healthy children and younger adults. That makes a human-adapted strain particularly dangerous to global workforce stability.
So the key is to balance vigilance with preparedness, not panic.
Exactly. The good news is that the world is far better positioned than it was in early 2020. We're not starting from scratch. We now possess H5-specific candidate vaccines. We've established mRNA and viral vector manufacturing platforms that can be rapidly scaled up. And we have existing stockpiles of broad-spectrum antivirals.
But the warning is a pressure point for policymakers.
It is. It demands immediate, serious investment in two areas. First, moving from just having candidate vaccines to actually starting pre-pandemic production to ensure the scale is ready when we need it. And second, tightening biosafety regulations in intensive farming and livestock operations worldwide. Environmental and animal welfare groups cite these high-density farming practices as key drivers of zoonotic risk. They create the perfect biological mixing bowls for viruses to jump species and mutate.
And alongside that looming global threat, we're also seeing significant domestic public health challenges, stemming both from community gaps and, well, institutional failures.
In South Carolina's upstate region, a growing measles outbreak was confirmed on this date. With at least 55 confirmed cases and over 130 individuals quarantined, this is a serious public health challenge. Measles, a virus that was once considered eliminated in the U.S., has reemerged almost exclusively among unvaccinated children in communities with long-standing entrenched vaccine hesitancy.
And this just reignites that fierce, polarizing debate over public health policy versus individual liberties.
It does. Pediatricians and public health officials argue for tightening state school vaccine requirements and limiting non-medical exemptions. They stress that high community-wide vaccination rates are essential to protect the vulnerable infants, the immunocompromised, the elderly. But opponents argue that such mandates infringe upon parental rights and personal medical choice.
And at the same time, we saw a significant and frankly alarming failure in food safety enforcement.
Yes, a nationwide outbreak of infant botulism was conclusively linked to Byheart Whole Nutrition infant formula. 37 babies across 17 states were sickened, and all of them required intensive hospitalization.
The company did issue a recall, though, right?
They did. They immediately issued a voluntary recall of all affected lots.
Yeah.
But here's the institutional failure that the source material reveals. Even after the recall was announced and made public, the contaminated formula was still found on store shelves at major national retailers. We're talking Walmart, Target, Kroger.
Wow. So that reveals critical, potentially life-threatening gaps in recall execution and enforcement across the entire supply chain.
Absolutely. It raises very serious questions about the FDA's capacity and authority to ensure that contaminated, life-threatening products are removed quickly and decisively from shelves and out of the hands of consumers. It just underscores the fragility of these complex supply chains when trust is paramount.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the rapid pace of scientific progress does offer powerful hope. It proves that sustained investment in R&D yields monumental results, even amidst all this global chaos.
It really does. And the most compelling story here is the progress in gene therapy. Researchers reported a huge success in treating severe combined immunodeficiency, historically known as bubble boy disease, where children are born without a functioning immune system.
And how does it work? The mechanism is fascinating.
It's elegant and it's powerful. Researchers successfully utilized a modified, non-replicating form of the HIV virus. You should think of the HIV shell as a highly efficient Trojan horse. They remove its pathogenic payload and they substitute a healthy copy of the defective gene. This modified virus is then used to insert the functional gene into the child's stem cells.
And that effectively restores their full immune function.
It does. It allows the child to live a normal, healthy life outside of isolation. And this signals the true maturation of gene therapy as a standard, life-altering treatment for inherited diseases.
Meanwhile, in structural biology, researchers achieved stunning progress with pathogens that we've known about for decades. They generated new, high-resolution, three-dimensional images of the yellow fever virus, reaching near-atomic resolution.
Right, and this breakthrough allowed them to visualize key structural differences between the vaccine strain and the virulent disease-causing strains. This isn't just a pretty picture. It provides a critical, detailed roadmap for designing next-generation vaccines for yellow fever and related flaviviruses, like dengue and Zika. It allows scientists to target vulnerabilities with unprecedented precision.
And then moving to personalized medicine, we also saw new research challenging these long-standing, broad public health guidelines. New studies argued that the prevailing heart health guidelines, which focus on general risk factors like cholesterol and BMI, they fail to detect most people affected by certain deadly inherited conditions, these genetic killers.
Yeah, for instance, conditions like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or familial hypercholesterolemia often go undiagnosed until there's a catastrophic event. This research adds significant weight to calls for more personalized screening, meaning incorporating genetic testing, detailed family history assessments, and new biomarkers into routine preventative cardiology.
Which raises crucial questions for health policymakers about how to equitably deploy these costly genetic tests without widening existing health disparities.
That's the key challenge. And finally, there's a really striking detail that links environmental change and public health. Researchers reported the first confirmed fatality directly attributable to a tick-induced meat allergy, known as alpha-gal syndrome.
A death from a meat allergy caused by a tick bite.
Yes. And this confirmed death underscores the severity of a condition that's often viewed as just a painful inconvenience. It dramatically raises the profile of alpha-gal syndrome, especially as environmental changes linked to climate patterns are believed to be expanding tick habitats across the U.S. and globally. And that's leading to more human exposure and a higher incidence of this potentially deadly allergy.
We have completed an exhaustive, and I have to say, a very sobering journey across the global landscape of November 27th, 2025. We've covered 4 continents, we've witnessed governments struggle with the most basic mandates of security, watched global economies absorb these massive partisan shocks, and observed the relentless, amplified force of nature magnified by systemic vulnerability.
And if we synthesize this immense stack of information, the unifying theme becomes really clear. The world is struggling with the profound tension between short-term political pressures and long-term systemic risks. Whether it's the partisan fight over security and immigration in D.C., the rapid policy rollback in Canada due to regional economic demands, or the failure to enforce fire codes in Hong Kong, the underlying failures is the struggle to look beyond the next election cycle or the immediate financial pressure.
So we're seeing this consistent policy trade-off. Governments are routinely choosing the path of least political resistance, even when that means deferring necessary investment in these fundamental systems. Climate resilience, robust infrastructure, equitable public health systems, and critical biosafety measures.
And the knowledge you've gained today isn't just about the facts of what happened on this one day. It's about recognizing that recurring pattern of vulnerability and the policy trade-offs that define our era. These aren't isolated events. They are symptoms of an interconnected systemic fragility.
And that fragility leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the confirmed fatality from the tick-induced alpha-gal syndrome, a condition intrinsically linked to environmental change, and the stark, explicit warning about the high fatality rate of the circulating H5 bird flu, what does the convergence of rapid environmental shifts and severe biological risks tell us about which once-in-a-generation health crisis we should be prioritizing immediate substantial investment in right now? Is the world dedicating enough resources to pre-pandemic preparedness, or are our political systems too fixated on the visible immediate crises like economic volatility and localized conflicts? Think about that balance.